All right, but isn't a secular conception of morality still missing something crucial? Like, isn't it still missing the part which makes you actually do something? Don't many of us ask the question, but why should I be moral? Or why should I follow up somebody's interests? I think this is a way of misframing the issue and making out something to be a problem which isn't an issue at all. We have the opposite problem. If you look at how human beings behave, they have always already responded to moral calls surrounding them. And this is a point that I think Herbert Mead made, that if you hadn't responded as a child to the moral expectations, or the calls, if you want, of your surrounding caregivers, by simply following their pointing gestures. So when your parents were pointing at something, when you hadn't looked at what they're pointing at, by doing so, you're basically following up the interests of somebody else. You're aligning your field of vision, you're aligning your perception with the perception of somebody else who's surrounding you. You are following a moral imperative, right? You're following the interest of somebody else. Long before you can ask the question, but why should I? If you had never done that as a child, that's the point that Mead is making, you wouldn't ever have developed self-reflective consciousness in the first place. Children are moral beings from the very start. The moment they have an attention span and the moment they are responsive, they respond to first-person demands surrounding them. And you don't always have to enforce it with force, right? They just do. They just curiously follow what you make them see. They explore what you make them see. And they're just as curious about your incentives that you bring to the child and what you make them experience and see as they're curious about first-person reality. So this goes way back. I mean, the response that we have to reality is much more in a sense of being inherently curious about it and responding to it than being I'll wait here and do nothing, will not do anything unless somebody gives me a really, really good reason to do something. That's just not coherent with how conscious creatures are. None of the conscious creatures we know are like that. Not human beings, not animals. We are all immediately already responsive to first-person demands surrounding them, including animals. Animals also don't need a good reason to listen to you, and yet they do. Well, some of them, others don't. but certain animals, which are capable of responding to first-person reality and even recognizing first-person reality, I'm pretty sure dogs can do that. I'm pretty sure dogs have a sense for you not being just a feeding mechanism, but you being an experiencing being as well to them, and them responding to your interiority. I think animals are capable of that, and they are already doing that. They don't need good reasons for that. And this is a modern way of thinking about this, because again, in modernity, we have paid a little bit more attention to how consciousness seems to be structured across all sentient beings, and we see common features between us. So what we thought initially would be a big issue, like why would you do something? What would force you? How would the universe force you to act in a moral way? Actually turns out to be the exact opposite framing of what we should actually, of how we should frame it, namely, which is that if you hadn't already responded to first-person demands surrounding you, you wouldn't have become the being which is self-reflective, capable of abstract thought, who could then ask the question, but why should I do something? You could never have become purely genetically that kind of being. To go through that evolutionary process from a pre-verbal being to becoming a verbal being that is capable of understanding propositions, including the question, but why should I do something? You have to go through a developmental process. And this process assumes that you have been a responsive being from the start. Why we are, I don't know. I have no idea why we are responsive beings. But it's obvious, again, and the observation that Mead has been making, that if you hadn't been such a responsive being from the start, you wouldn't be a social being. You wouldn't be a being that is capable of coordinating your interests with the interests of others surrounding you. And you wouldn't even come to the position of asking questions about your interests and the interests of others. Right? So I think here the traditional framing, which comes from the religious context, is itself the product of a modern propositional mindset, which we took for granted as having a particular insight into reality, but I think is a very incomplete way of thinking about how consciousness works, and actually a false way of thinking about how morality works and how we come to something like experience in the first place. And it's possible, by the way, I think, to be wrong in this regard by not taking seriously the genetic aspect. So in the sense of Genesis, the genetic and evolutionary aspect of consciousness. And this is a pretty recent idea. I mean, this stuff, this is a point that Wilber has been making. Kant, for example, was not aware of the genetic aspect of human consciousness up until his manuscripts written in very, very late in his life. So the Critique of Pure Reason, for example, has been written from a perspective which was not really taking into account that consciousness is not just a given, but consciousness evolves in children. And consciousness is also something that very likely evolves in human beings as a species. That's an idea that was, to the younger Kant, which is the well-known Kant, it's not something that he has taken seriously in his work. And even in 20th century thinking, most thinking around how consciousness has to be understood and what its basic features are is not genetic. It's not looking at the genesis of how consciousness comes into being. Even someone like Edmund Husserl, who has spent his entire career thinking about experience as experience, only in his later works, in Erfahrung und Urteil, I can't remember the English translation of it, experience and judgment, I don't know. Only in his later works comes to actually think about consciousness as something that is genetic, something that has a developmental aspect to itself. And this is something that's easy to overlook. It's not something that's obvious. It's something that has not been visible to many traditions which have been dealing with these issues for millennia, actually. And it's a pretty recent idea, the idea that we have to look at this as a developmental process. And this is what Mead has been doing. Mead has been looking at consciousness not as the self-given, self-contained, reflexive, and thinking in abstract terms about its surrounding world subject, but Mead has been looking at consciousness of, hey, let's look at the first signs of it in human children, and let's see how we get from the most simple form of consciousness that we can meaningfully speak about to something like self-reflective consciousness, where you position yourself in your body, and not only are you aware of being embodied and being positioned in space, but you become aware of your own consciousness in the sense of how your own consciousness makes sense of reality. So you start to become aware of the basic metaphors that you use to grasp, to take hold of reality. This form of self-reflection is not the same form of self-reflection that you see in animals, where suddenly an animal starts recognizing its own mirror image and tries wiping off a spot that you've painted on their chin or on their nose. That's not the same thing. This is not the same form of self-awareness when you start thinking about how you think about reality. This has a genetic process to it, which is rather complicated, and the idea that this has to be traced is pretty young. So I think it's easy to make the mistake to start with the judgment. What do I have to do? Like, what would make me do something? And expect this to be a one-to-one match with reality. Expect reality to bound expect reality to knee before you and basically succumb to your expectations rather than the other way around and ask the question, but wait a minute, am I asking a meaningful question? Is this really the way that sentient organisms are behaving? Do they ask the question of why from the start? Or how does the development, how do they get from pre-reflexive consciousness, pre-verbal consciousness, into something like a self-conception where they can raise the question of why in the first place? Because again, they're not born with the question why. Why should I do something? They get there, and usually in their teenage years, they start asking these questions. And many of these questions, by the way, are just false questions. It's something that we figured out in the 20th century, that many of the questions that we thought for centuries were good questions and were making a good point, were actually the result of, as Wittgenstein has put it, bewitchment through language. They sound reasonable, but only because you've gotten there on a certain thinking path, not because they're reasonable questions, but because you hold other beliefs to be true at the same time. And in this context, a certain question seems reasonable to you. But when you try to fiddle a little bit with those assumptions that you're making, suddenly you start figuring out that certain questions are absurd. Like again, the question, but why should I do something, right? Expecting the world to give you a must for your moral action. This is just absolutely not compatible with how any being that is responsive to moral demands is actually acting in the real world out there. We don't need these reasons, but we have the opposite problem, again, that we are far too responsive to moral expectations, to moral demands put on us, and get far too easily entangled in all of them without being able to make a meaningful break and distance ourselves from expectations, which again is something that many industries have been using to lure us into paying attention to things that are not inherently in our interest, but in their interest. This is not something that we're doing because someone is giving us a good reason to do something, but this is something that we're doing because that's the way human consciousness reacts to reality. It's responsive to reality. And this is what, again, many industries are counting on. Many industries are counting on us being immediately responsive and working with that fact about reality, about the reality of our own consciousness.